The sun lights up the sky, and hummingbirds do fly.
One thing I'm sure you've heard, the many, many fairy tales and myths that are out there about dragons turning into a prince or a princess. Recently, I heard one of these stories told by a colleague of mine. I think he said it was from Sweden. And the way this one went, there was an evil dragon that was terrorizing a kingdom, and finally, when it had become so bad, so intolerable, the king and the queen went to see the dragon to try to see if they could buy the dragon off somehow, bribe the dragon, or find a way to get the dragon to stop destroying their kingdom. And the dragon told them that he would be glad to stop under one condition. The condition was that they allow him to marry their daughter. They looked at each other with shock and resignation and then said, okay. I mean, what choice did they have? So they went home and they found their daughter and they told her, honey, we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that we've found a way to save the kingdom. The bad news is that you are going to have to marry the dragon. And just like so many of these stories, the plot thickens for a while, and eventually something happens that leads to the transformation of the dragon into a very handsome prince. And guess what? They lived happily ever after. Now, there are many variations on these stories, and sometimes the things that changes the dragon into a prince is a kiss, true love's kiss, or it happens because a person believes in the dragon's goodness, and it's their belief in the dragon's inherent worth that transforms the beast. Sometimes it's a noble deed that does the trick. Now, I bring this up so that we could explore the idea that comes from a letter from Maria Rilke that says, how could we forget those ancient myths about dragons that at the last moment are transformed into princes or princesses? Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princes or princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is in its deepest essence something helpless that wants our love. Now, what if Rilke is right? And the things in our lives that we fear, and the things that are causing us trouble and terrorizing us are like these fairy tale dragons? What if these problems of ours are waiting for our attention, or our love, or our belief, or for a noble response from us? And if we could muster it, our response to them could turn them into something of beauty and worth. I want to take us on a little journey this morning to consider what it would mean for us to learn to approach our fears with love. And how might you and I approach the challenges in our lives differently if we understood them as part of a larger, noble story of transformation? When one reads of the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years in the book of Exodus in the Bible, we are struck by the realization that these are very normal acting people with all their flaws and mistakes and worries and anxieties and neuroses and everything else. They're just like you and me. And they had no idea that as they were living each day in the wilderness, that their life stories would eventually become the stuff of Scripture. And that generations of people would read and reread and model their lives after them and would look to their deeds and misdeeds to discover truth and wisdom. So much of the Scriptures are made up of ordinary people with ordinary problems. The holy stories, at least in the Jewish and the Christian traditions, are mostly about people who seem just as flawed and just as fearful and just as tempted and just as distracted as you and me. But like them, you and I don't usually think of our daily decisions and actions as sacred stories. And most people don't usually think of their lives as part of how God is working in the world. But what if we were to imagine that our lives are part of a larger drama of freedom unfolding and of the evolution of human consciousness? Even those Israelites who wandered in that desert so long ago weren't always sure that they believed that there really was a God that was with them, helping them, caring for them, or who cared about what they did or what they didn't do. Remember, they rebelled, they rejected, they questioned, they doubted, and they appeared not to really know, and certainly not to be sure, and if there was anything that they could consider to be God or a higher power. Like many of us, they were not sure they believed that there is something that could be kind and benevolent or a judging or a willful spirit. How different are they really than us? And what would it mean if we were to imagine that we are part of a sacred story, each playing a significant role? That's to say, what if we were to decide that we are not just individuals in this life, but are part of a group, part of a community of people that goes back in time and includes all of those who gave of themselves to advance human freedom, and includes all of those yet to come who will carry on the advancement of human consciousness and justice long after we're gone. It's about waking up to the realization that our lives are not independent from history nor separate from the whole of humanity. What if we were to decide that our daily decisions matter to more than just ourselves? Now, I'll never forget one night when I was in theological school. I was studying for my final exams in Christian scriptures, of all things, and I needed to walk to the library to look something up. And on my way across the main campus, I saw two female Muslim students walking together wearing traditional Muslim head coverings. They looked like they might have been from Indonesia. They were clearly having a nice time, talking enthusiastically to one another as they walked. And I said hello as they passed by, and they nodded politely and kept walking. And it could not have been 30 seconds later when I heard a group of young men yelling and laughing a little ways down the yard in the direction of those two young Muslim women. It was something like, "Why are you still wearing those rags on your heads? You're in America now." And my heart stopped. But did I turn around and confront the young men? No. Did I turn to go walk beside the two women to show my solidarity and make sure they were safe? I didn't. I just kept walking to the library to study the Christian scriptures so I could pass the exam that was so dominating my existence. I got an A on the test the next day and in the class, but ever since then, I couldn't help feeling like I completely flunked Christian scriptures. And like the disciple Peter, the moment I walked away from that situation, I heard off in the distance a cock crow. What I've come to see is that we're all living in the midst of competing choices and compelling choices and problems. Like the king and the queen who are trying to balance being good parents with their responsibilities to the entire kingdom. We're all trying to balance what could be called our ordinary and everyday choices and problems with playing our part in the grand and noble struggle for freedom and justice. This morning, we're just 3 weeks away from the 50th anniversary of the civil rights marches in Selma, Alabama. I don't know about you, but I went to see the movie recently. It's a good movie. I recommend it. And predictably, as I saw the clergy who went down to support the cause, I imagined that if I were around then, I would have been one of them. Yet I was also struck by the reality that one of my colleagues, James Reeb, who was a white Unitarian minister and who had served a church named All Souls in Washington, D.C., and who had a wife and small children, just like I do, he was among the many who did heed Dr. King's call to go to Selma. And if you saw the movie or know the history, he's the one who was brutally beaten to death by a 2x4 out on the streets after leaving a black-only restaurant because he didn't want to patronize the white-only restaurants. Now, it's much easier to look back on history and imagine what role we would have played if we had been there. But let's face it, we're all balancing our ordinary, everyday problems with the great problems of human existence, with the great struggle for freedom and justice. I'm reminded of a conversation I had not that long ago with a member of this church. It was right after I had delivered a message talking about the role this church played in the civil rights movement and our minister emeritus, Dr. John Wolfe, the different things he did back in the 60s. And this gentleman, who is white, came to talk to me to explain that he and his wife and his family were members of this church at that time while all this was happening during the civil rights marches here in Tulsa. The citywide interfaith and interracial memorial service held right here at All Souls after Bloody Sunday in Selma. And when Dr. Wolfe was helping lead the movement to have the superintendent of Tulsa Public Schools fired for his refusal to integrate the schools. While all of that important and transformational and revolutionary stuff was going on, even though they were committed members of this church, he admitted he can barely remember any of it even happening. He explained how he and his wife were young, they were busy with their careers and raising their children, and they just were not very tuned in to what was happening. They cannot figure out really how they missed it, but they did. A profoundly sacred and timeless struggle for justice and freedom was happening all around them and inviting their participation, but they did not hear the call. It wasn't that they lacked compassion or courage. In fact, on the contrary, these are two of the most courageous and caring and justice-centered and focused people I know today. They just were not tuned in. Now, while some Americans were being blown off the streets with fire hoses, being spit on and told they weren't worthy of equality, others were watering their lawns with garden hoses, unaware that they too were playing a role in this powerful drama of history. While one wife was pleading with her husband, please don't go back out and protest this weekend. You'll be beaten. You could be arrested. You could lose your job. You might be killed. Another wife was asking her husband which movie and restaurant he wanted to go to that weekend. People living in the same country, in the same city, sometimes even in the same church, were seemingly living in two different worlds. And it's still true today. And it's not because of a lack of caring. It's mostly because we get so focused on our everyday realities and stresses, on our final exams, on our parental duties, that we're not always aware of the larger story we're a part of. And it's hard to keep the balance between all of this. What if we could step off the dance floor of our lives every once in a while and get onto the balcony and look down at the revelry and the celebration and all the craziness that's happening down there on the dance floor? What might we see that we cannot see when we're out there in the middle of the dance? What if we realize that our lives are about so much more than we often think? And that as the profound movements of human history and progress are underway, we are either in it or against it or on the sidelines. But these events are happening all the time, and we're always playing one of these roles. Might the broader perspective help transform our relationship with our own problems, our own everyday problems? What if we could be reminded that even in the midst of 1,000,000 everyday obstacles and 1,000 important life decisions, that we are also intimately connected to the long and important struggle for human dignity? Because it's possible to ace an exam but still fail the test of what it means to be human. It's possible to sleepwalk through the revolution. And it's easy to turn our backs on our neighbors and on the environment, which are really two sides of the same coin. The change of perspective that I'm referring to is the kind that transforms us from being a victim of our own life to being a hero or heroine of our own story. Remember the daughter of the king and the queen who was told that when she was told that she would have to marry that stinking dragon? She sure seemed like the victim at first. When I heard it, I was thinking to myself, here's another one of those old-fashioned, sexist, misogynistic fairy tales. And I'm sure upon learning that she had to marry that dragon, the princess would have felt pretty persecuted and pretty PO'd. But what I love about these stories is that the one who at first appears to be the victim eventually becomes the victor. The one who seems to be in need of a hero becomes the hero. The one who appears to need to be saved ends up being the savior. There are times when all of us feel like the victims in our own story. How might we apply the wisdom of the princess and the dragon? That's to say, how might we bring our attention and our love to the dragons that fill our days with fear and with difficulty? I think the first thing is it begins with meeting our fear with love. Which means when we're feeling afraid and we're feeling conflicted, we can ask ourselves, what's the loving thing to do? There's a lot of other questions that come up, but to ask, but what's the loving thing to do? We can commit ourselves to always act out of love rather than fear. That's a big one. It's easy to say, it's a lot harder to live. And it also has to do with remembering that we are not only living ordinary lives, we are also at the same time part of and connected to the ancient and cosmic struggle for freedom. With this kind of awareness and this commitment to love, people continually transform the world. And we don't just do it in the grand historical moments like Selma. We do it in 1,000 everyday decisions. Sometimes we do it while walking to the library, or when we volunteer to teach a child to read. We do it when we decide to look anew at our closet full of coats, most of which we may never wear, and give some away to a homeless veteran who certainly deserves to be warm. We do it when we welcome a stranger into our church and let them know that they have a place here among us. Sometimes some of us who've been here for a long time forget how life-changing such a welcome from a stranger in this place can be, and how good it can feel, and how life-changing this church can be. I saw a woman as I was walking in this morning out in the parking lot, and she was walking into church carrying a can of food. And so I asked her what she was doing, and she explained to me that she brings a can of food every Sunday and gives it to our community resource bank. And she said, I do it because it's just a reminder every week that I have enough, and I have more than enough. And I said, you're going to love my sermon this morning. She didn't know she was going to be in it. Now, I hadn't been in Tulsa very long when the Jewish section of one of our local cemeteries had been desecrated. I wasn't going to miss out this time on an opportunity to show up and to do the right thing. Of course, I had a sermon to write, and there's never enough time. And I had a new baby to care for, and dishes in the sink, and a list of to-dos that weren't going to take care of themselves. It was over 110 degrees outside, and not a blessed cloud in the sky that day. The list of credible excuses was long. And yet, when I got to the graveyard and found my place among the other supporters, do you know who was standing there right next to me, showing solidarity with the Jews who were being ridiculed and terrorized? 2 Muslim women with head coverings. And as I pulled myself up off that 110-degree dance floor, and I looked down at a bird's eye view for a moment, it all made perfect sense. Every day we have at least 100 choices, and it matters what we do. May you learn to confront and transform the dragons in your life with love. And may you never lose sight of the profound and ongoing human struggle for freedom and justice. Because Black lives matter, immigrant lives matter, the environment matters, transgender lives matter, gay and lesbian lives matter, Muslim lives matter. Your choices matter. The struggle for freedom and justice continues. Are you in it, against it, or on the sidelines? Because it matters.
Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world to our ministry and what we're doing at All Souls here in Tulsa. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. I'm always pleased when I get messages from different people who tell me all kinds of things about the impact of All Souls Tulsa's ministry on them and their lives and their families. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.